After graduating college, I found myself in that awkward in-between phase, out of school but not yet settled into a career. Jobs were scarce and I needed money to survive, so I took what I could get, a position at a local gas station. I was embarrassed. 4 years and 50 grand for a finance degree, and here I was, scanning candy bars and cigarettes. Most of the time, I worked the day shift, an 8 to 5 gig that at least felt normal. But occasionally, I got stuck with the dreaded overnight shift. That's when it happened, the event that would change my life forever. I had clocked in that night already in a bad mood, annoyed that I had to waste my time at this dead-end job, but I tried to make the best of it. I planned to spend most of the night watching movies on my phone, killing time until morning. It was a quiet night, well after midnight. The gas station was dead, and my mind was half asleep when it happened. The buzzer went off, the one connected to the buttons at the gas pumps that customers could press if they needed assistance. It almost never went off, even during the day. I glanced up from my phone, puzzled. With a sigh, I got up and walked over to the glass wall that overlooked the pumps. But when I looked outside, there was no one there, not a single car. Thinking it was just a glitch, I shrugged it off and went back behind the counter. I had barely settled back into my chair when the buzzer went off again. This time, I jumped up, a bit more alert. I walked back to the window and looked out carefully. And that's when I saw him, a person standing by one of the pumps, staring directly at me. The person was wearing a clown mask. We locked eyes through the glass, or at least I felt like we did. I couldn't see their eyes behind the mask, but I knew they were looking right at me. Suddenly, the person started waving, like we were old friends. Something wasn't right. There was an oddness to the way they moved, a stiffness. After a few seconds, I found myself waving back, almost instinctively. As soon as I did, the clown jumped up and down like they were overjoyed and then took off running down the road, disappearing into the darkness. I stood there, stunned. Then I started laughing. It had to be a prank. Some kid messing around, probably recording it for a laugh. I figured I was already on some YouTube channel titled Gas Station Pranks or something. I shook my head, still chuckling a bit, and sat back down to continue my movie. Half an hour went by without incident. Then, the buzzer went off again. This time, I was a little irritated. The prank was funny once, but now it was just getting annoying. I groaned and got up, walking back to the window. As I looked out, my heart nearly stopped. The clown was back, standing just inches from the glass, face pressed up against it, staring at me. I jumped back, letting out a startled yell. The clown didn't move, just kept staring. Then slowly, they started waving again. My fear turned to anger. I stormed over to the glass, shouting through it, telling him to leave now or I'd call the cops. The clown's shoulders slumped, as if disappointed, and they turned and walked around to the side of the building, out of sight. I stood there for a few minutes, waiting to see if he would come back, but he didn't. I was a mix of angry and uneasy as I went back to my chair. For the next hour, I kept glancing at the window every few minutes, but there was no sign of the clown. Eventually, I got absorbed in my movie again, almost forgetting about the whole thing. But then, the buzzer went off again. I slammed my phone down, more furious than ever. Enough was enough. I was ready to give this person a piece of my mind. I stomped over to the door, flung it open, and stepped outside, prepared to yell. But then I froze. The clown was back, standing by the pumps. But this time, he wasn't alone. There were at least 8 others with him, all wearing different clown masks. They were all arranged in a line, all facing me, all completely still, like statues. My heart pounded in my chest. I didn't know how long I stood there, just staring. Then, the first clown, the original one, took a step towards me. My paralysis broke. I darted back inside the store, slamming the door and locking it behind me. I turned around and they were all there, standing right outside the glass, faces pressed up against it, waving. I was absolutely terrified. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my hands trembling so much I almost dropped it. As I tried to explain to the dispatcher what was happening, the clowns started banging on the windows, all in unison, a deafening, rhythmic pounding. One of them tried the door, jiggling the handle, but it held firm. I screamed into the phone, begging the dispatcher to send help, my voice barely coherent. Then, I remembered something. The owner of the gas station kept a gun in the office. I bolted to the back, flinging the office door open, and yanked the drawer where I knew the gun was. The banging continued, louder now, echoing through the empty store. I grabbed the gun, my fingers slick with sweat, and ran back to the counter. The clowns were still at the window, but one of them stepped in front of the door. He had a metal baseball bat. He looked at me, waved slowly, then swung the bat at the door. The glass shattered, and I screamed. Without thinking, I raised the gun and fired. The sound was deafening in the small space, and I kept pulling the trigger until it just clicked. When I looked up, the clowns were gone. All of them had scattered into the darkness. Moments later, I heard the wail of sirens approaching. The police arrived, flooding the area with lights, but there was no sign of the clowns. They found all the clown masks, though, laid out neatly on the hood of my car, which had been completely destroyed. Every window smashed, tires slashed. I never found out why they targeted me or who they were. I never saw them again, but the sight of those masks staring at me from the darkness still haunts me. Sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I swear I can hear that buzzer going off, and I wonder if one day they'll come back. When I was younger, I worked at a gas station that was literally in the middle of nowhere. It was a run-down building near the interstate, and I never understood even how it stayed open. Hardly ever anyone stopped, and most who did just pumped their gas and got right back on the road. The few who bothered to come inside were mostly locals, so if a stranger walked in, it was a rare and memorable event. But there was one time when someone did stop by, and it's an event that still haunts me. It was a hot summer afternoon, and I hadn't seen a single customer all day, not even someone stopping for gas. Suddenly, I saw one of those big RVs, the kind that looks like a house on wheels, pull up to the pumps. I noticed it right away because, like I said, seeing anyone new was a big deal. From where I stood behind the counter, I had a clear view of all 6 pumps, but no one got out of the RV. I watched for a while, expecting someone to emerge, but minutes ticked by, and no one stepped out. I couldn't see anyone sitting in the driver's seat. The small windows were covered by blinds or curtains, and there was no movement inside, at least that I could see. Nearly 20 minutes went by, and still nothing. Curiosity started to mix in with a bit of concern. I walked over to the front door and peered through the glass, trying to get a better look. The RV sat there, perfectly still, almost as if it had been abandoned. I debated with myself about whether if I should go check it out or not and see if everybody was okay, but I didn't want to intrude. For all I knew, the driver was just taking a nap. An hour passed, then another, and still, there was no sign of life. Frustration started to creep in. They were blocking an entire side of the pumps, and while we didn't get much business, it still seemed inconsiderate to hog the space. Finally, after nearly 2 hours, one of the regulars, Chet, pulled up in his truck. Chet stepped out, gave the RV a curious glance, then headed inside to grab his usual chips and pop. When he came up to pay, he asked me who the RV belonged to. I told him it had been parked there for over 2 hours and that I hadn't seen or heard from anyone inside. He frowned and looked back at the RV. We both agreed that they must be taking a nap, while we did also agree that it was very weird that they didn't even come out of the RV at all. After Chet left, I was alone again. Another 3 hours crawled by, making it 6 hours total that the RV had been there without a peep. I checked my watch and realized it was time to close up for the day. Part of me wanted to leave it alone, but curiosity got the better of me. I decided to at least knock on the door to make sure everything was okay. I walked outside, the sun hanging low over the sky, casting long shadows across the empty parking lot. As I approached the RV, a strange feeling settled in my gut. I knocked on the door and waited, listening intently. No sound came from inside. I knocked again, harder this time. Still nothing. Pressing my ear to the door, I strained to hear any sign of movement or life, but there was only silence. I looked down at the door handle. My hand hesitated, hovering over it. I knew it was probably a bad idea, but I just wanted to make sure everything was alright. I turned the handle slowly, surprised to find it unlocked. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the door open. The smell hit me like a wall. It was a stench so foul it made my eyes water and I gagged, stumbling backwards, coughing as I tried not to vomit. Whatever was inside, it wasn't good. I slammed the door shut and ran back into the gas station, grabbing the phone to call the police. As I spoke to the dispatcher, explaining the situation, I saw something from the corner of my eye. The RV door, on the opposite side of where I'd been standing, opened slightly. I knew this because from underneath the RV, I could see feet. They were wearing heavy leather boots, the kind you might find on a construction worker. I told the dispatcher what I saw, and she urged me to stay inside until police arrived. I kept my eyes on those boots, barely blinking. They stayed still for a few moments, then slowly began to move away from the RV, out of my line of sight. I moved to the far side of the window to get a better look, but I saw no one. Then, a loud bang came from the other side of the building, like something hitting the window. I jumped and spun around, my heart racing. Pressing my face against the glass, I peered outside. At first, I saw nothing, but then my eyes fell on something that made me literally drop the phone. It was a severed hand, lying on the ground just outside the window. I screamed and ducked behind the counter, my hands shaking as I reached for the gun we kept hidden there. I begged the dispatcher to hurry the police, every second feeling like an eternity. I stayed crouched behind the counter, waiting to hear the front door open or glass shatter, but it was silent. Finally, after what felt like hours but was only minutes, I heard the sound of sirens approaching. Red and blue lights flashed outside and I breathed a sigh of relief. An officer came into the gas station, pulling me outside and over to one of the squad cars. The police searched the area thoroughly, but they found no trace of the person who had stepped out of the RV. What they found inside the RV, though, was even more disturbing. There was a severed foot neatly placed on the small kitchen table inside, and the smell was still as overpowering as it was when I first opened the door. Besides the hand and the foot, the RV was empty, looking almost brand new. One of the officers mentioned to another that there was no way the smell could have come from just a hand and a foot, and they looked fresh, without any signs of decay. Whoever had left them there hadn't done it long ago. To this day, I have no idea who the person was in the RV, or why they left those gruesome trophies behind. The police never found them, and I heard no more about the incident. That day was enough to make me leave town and never look back. I can't get the sight of that severed hand out of my mind. I still don't know why they came to the gas station, and why they never came out of the RV. When I was in college, I worked a part-time job at a gas station near campus. I took the night shift, which seemed like an awful job to most people, but it worked out perfectly for me. I was always a night owl, struggling to sleep at times, so staying up all night didn't bother me. After midnight, things were always slow, and even though we were on a college campus, I might see less than 10 people the entire shift. This gave me plenty of time to study and do my homework. Occasionally I had to deal with the odd drunk college kid, but nothing too crazy. Except for one night that still haunts me. I clocked in at 8 p.m. for my usual shift. Maggie, my coworker, was wrapping up her shift and getting ready to leave. We chatted for a bit before she headed out. She was always good company, but by 8:30 I was alone, as I would be until 4 a.m. when the next person came in. The first few hours were uneventful. I stocked shelves, did some inventory, and watched a few customers come and go. Around midnight, things quieted down, and I hadn't seen anyone in over an hour. Having completed my task for the shift, I decided to sit behind the counter and get some homework done. I put on some music and got really into the paper I was writing. That's when I heard the front door open. From my spot behind the counter, a lottery ticket rack blocked my view of the entrance, so I couldn't see who came in. I quickly finished the sentence I was typing, turned off my music, and leaned over to look past the rack, but no one was there. I got up and looked down each aisle. The store was small and I could see down every aisle except one from the counter. Even when I stood on my chair to see over the racks, I couldn't see anyone in the aisle that was out of view. If someone was there, they would have to have been crouching down to avoid being seen. I sat back down, a bit on edge, but trying to convince myself it was nothing. I waited quietly for several minutes, listened intently for any sound, but nothing. I told myself it was just my imagination, or maybe someone had opened the door and decided not to come in. I turned my music back on and returned to my homework. About an hour had passed without a single customer. I was deep into my paper, but I needed a break. I got up, stretched, and decided to grab a drink from the cooler. The cooler was the one aisle that wasn't visible from the counter. As I walked over and opened the cooler door, I heard a rustling sound behind me. I spun around, just tall enough to see over the top of the racks. Nothing. I walked back to the counter, checking each aisle carefully. As I reached the front, I noticed a bag of chips on the floor. That must have been the noise. A bag of chips falling off the shelf. I laughed at myself for being so jumpy and picked it up, putting it back on the shelf. Back behind the counter, I went to sit down, but noticed something odd. My chair had been moved. Not much, just enough to be noticeable. I stared at it for a moment, feeling uneasy. I shook my head, trying to brush off the anxiety. I was just being paranoid. I moved the chair back to its original spot, turned the music up a bit louder, and tried to refocus on my paper. But I just couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. My skin prickled with unease, and I just couldn't concentrate anymore. Frustrated, I turned off the music and shut my laptop. I sat there for a moment, trying to calm myself down, telling myself that I was being ridiculous. There was nothing wrong, I was fine. Then I felt a weird sensation on my leg. It was wet, like a slight breeze or someone gently blowing on my skin. I scratched at it, looking down, but seeing nothing. A few moments later, I felt it again. I leaned forward, trying to look under the counter. There was a decent-sized space there, just big enough to store the chair in when it wasn't in use. As I bent down and looked into the dark space, my heart stopped. There, crouched under the counter, was a man. His face was so close to my leg that I could feel his breath on my skin. I froze, my mind unable to process what I was seeing. His eyes were wide, his smile even wider, his teeth bared a sick grin. He put a finger to his lips and whispered, "Shh." Panic surged through me. I screamed and pushed myself back, falling out of the chair and onto the floor. I kept screaming as I scrambled backwards, trying to get away from him. He started crawling out from under the counter, his laughter low and menacing, following me as I stumbled to my feet. I bolted for the door, desperate to get out, but he was right behind me. I could hear his footsteps, feel his presence, just a breath away. I threw open the door, thinking I was free, but then I felt his hand grab the back of my shirt, yanking me backwards. I struggled, thrashing wildly as I was pulled back into the store. I fell on the ground and he stood over me, that same horrific grin on his face. I was sure I was about to die. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. 3 guys were at one of the pumps, watching the whole thing unfold. I screamed again, louder this time, and they immediately rushed over, bursting through the door. What happened next is a blur. I remember the man being dragged away, the guys holding him down, someone calling the police. I must have blacked out at some point because the next thing I knew, I was on an ambulance and on my way to the hospital. They released me later that night. The police arrested the man and I was told he was some drifter who had been seen around campus a few times. The 3 guys who come to my rescue had saved my life. I'll never forget that night. The terror I felt. The pure fear. Now, whenever I feel like something's wrong, I trust my instincts.